Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is January 30th, 2019. Tonight, 21st century Canada rolls into the past. No more with NoLore, nor Loretto. So tell me, Canada, how's that shiny new 21st century working out for you so far? All of the promise and none of the institutional improvements delivered? Surprise! It's called neoliberal status quo. Change is bad, apparently, especially for those with traditional power and privilege to lose. In fact, let's use that influence to create new levels of mistrust, confusion, distraction, hopelessness, division, and violence. As long as any direct link to the manipulators is denied or obfuscated, carry on. Cash those checks. Those manipulators include government, political parties, corporate media, celebrities du jour, and anyone who sees the chance to get rich on misinformation. False prophets, false conflicts, inflated outrage, and innocent victims are the landscape. By the way, none of those victims ever seem to be from the forces encouraging this agenda so strongly. Nora Loretto is an author, freelance journalist, community organizer, activist, podcaster, mom, and proponent for systemic change. She's paid a disproportionate price for her views and ideas on how to move forward from the entrenched 20th century hegemony. Her long history of direct involvement and documentation of society's built-in restrictions to keep change out has given Nora perspectives not overly appreciated by the power structure. The View Up Here hosts Nora to discuss some of her work from 2018 and why so much of it signals the systemic weaknesses in today's society. Far more than a snapshot of the events and the time of occurrence, Nora's work brings much deeper questions about how the root issues seem to do nothing to prevent further chaos instead of encouraging increasing pace of it. The Sainte-Foy massacre, the Yonge Street attack, the New Age snake oil salesman Jordan Peterson, the incredibly new low in governance from Doug Ford, that is in fact a natural progression. This interview was recorded with Nora last week. Yesterday was the second anniversary of the Sainte-Foy massacre in Quebec City. Looks like it was quite an event. I'm not really sure how to describe it. A remembrance, but more. It's impressive to see. Well, as we get into the interview, you'll figure that out, but it's impressive to see a place as standalone and archaic in a lot of ways as Quebec City demonstrate this kind of spirit and togetherness. We'll get to that. Now, Nora is on Medium, and you can find pretty much all work she does cross-posted there, medium.com/@Nora Loretto. I'm going to read a little bit from a year-end column that she posted there. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Nora, your 2018 was horrible. Literally nothing good came from it. And really, I agree. My family was out of our apartment for 6 of 12 months thanks to 2 separate floods. My career took a gigantic shit thanks to a single tweet. I became lodged in 2 worlds. One world where I wasn't important enough to be noticed, and another where I was important enough to send one's most creative, illustrative death threat. Not important enough to be sought out for comment, but important enough for Jason Kenney to get out some of his pathetic male rage on. Yes, 2018 was not great. In 2016 and 17, I had done regular appearances on CBC platforms, the Current, the National, the 180, radio syndication. I had written regularly for the Walrus, and importantly, I cut out toxic, progressive organizations from my existence. 2018 started strong, and its promise ended with an April tweet. One that's not incorrect or objectively controversial, but that was so radioactive for Canada's colonial mainstream press that they couldn't deal with the heat. And so I became radioactive, such that there was truly a pre- and post-April. While I hope this changes, it might not. I was Canada's most deplatformed, most maligned writer. Not only did no one with any power publicly notice, very few people publicly cared. Articles were spiked. My pitches politely declined. I hobbled along, death threats in tow, with so few public defenders. I totally lost any faith in mainstream media to actually defend. I remain exceedingly cynical and bitter. I'm not going to lie and say otherwise. But time heals petty wounds, so who knows? Maybe in 2019, Canadian editors will find like a third of a nut and come around. Maybe not. The amazing support of average people who I interact with online kept me afloat. And so if that includes you, I'm endlessly grateful for your words and support. That's Nora's own words to, in a nutshell, describe her 2018. Now, without further ado, the view up here is pleased and honored to welcome to the show freelance journalist and new media entrant in the last little while, Nora Loretto. Welcome, Nora.
Hi.
It's great to have you on the show. I know that you ventured into, shall we say, alternative media to get your message out, and that is a podcast called Sandy and Nora. It's been getting excellent reviews. I'm sure your numbers are excellent as well. What was the impetus for you to get into this type of information delivery as opposed to print?
Well, I've spent most of my adult life in print media, I would say. It's writing and sharing analysis about news has been really the only thing I've been doing as an adult other than political activism. And so when it was suggested to me that I consider podcasting from someone who's a podcast producer, I realized that I had everything I needed at home to do it. And Sandy and I are very good friends, and we have very good political conversations. And so when this individual said, "Oh, have you ever thought about podcasting? Is there anyone who you would ever want to have a conversation with or record it?" I immediately thought of her. So it was more of a way for us to maintain our relationship because I've left Toronto and she's still in Toronto, while also having political conversations that we know a lot of our friends are having together. So we thought, why not record that and see how it flies.
And so far, so good. That would be an understatement, right?
Yeah, it's been really popular, which has been a lot of fun.
Well, that's good because, just listening to the content myself, it's like, yeah, there's a definite market out there for that. And the production is excellent as well, which is maybe more than I can say for the show you're currently on, but that's not really important. But the reason I wanted to have you on is because a lot of your work over 2018 is still resonating so strong today, and there are new offshoots, tangents of things you talked about that's right in front of us every day, and I think people need to wake up a little bit about that. But the first one I want to start with is almost a year ago exactly from when we're recording this, you wrote an article about the first anniversary of the Quebec City mosque shooting. There's a lot of things in there that surprised me, but then they apply everywhere. Did you really know some of the things you found out writing this about Quebec City, about how, I don't know what the word is, extreme it still is compared to a lot of the rest of the country, especially from, say, the GTA? Like, I was surprised to see how white Quebec City is compared to the rest of the country.
Right.
Were the real numbers surprising, or does it look like that there?
That's a really great question. So when I first moved here in 2012, I moved here from Toronto, and I remember being like shocked at how white the street was or the mall was. And it kind of depends on where you are, because if you're at the campus is diverse. There's communities where it's more diverse than, whatever the percentages of the whole city, 97 or 96%. And so there's definitely moments where I saw it very, very obviously, and where it hit me very, very clearly. One of the things that did surprise me when I was doing the statistical research for that article was how few second-generation people live here. And so you've got the vast majority of the city have lived in Canada for 3 generations or more. I would be part of that. My family's been in Canada for more than 3 generations. And then the second biggest chunk is 1 generation or less, and it's that second generation that is in the single digits. And so it tells me that there's not anything keeping people here, which isn't too surprising. The city's a monocultural city. It's a city of public servants. Like most, the biggest industry is the civil service. And the civil service is, unfortunately, got a long way to go in Quebec to be as diverse as the population is. But one of the other difficult things about the province is that the diversity really is concentrated in Montreal. And so when you get out of Montreal, you see cities like, the Saguenay region or Trois-Rivières or here that are statistically like unbelievably white. The only other cities that come close in the rest of Canada are Guelph and St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador. So that was one of the big surprises. But the rest of that article was very much from my own experience and the experience of people that I featured in that article. And I would say nothing from what they talked about, accessing the job market or the conditions that I referenced in that article. None of that surprised me. That's all stuff that, I see all the time or almost every day.
When I've been to Montreal, I found it to be a true cosmopolitan city. Toronto loves to talk about how they're a world city. In my opinion, Montreal is more of a world city in Canada than Toronto. So when I read this about, like you said, Quebec City, Saguenay, Trois-Rivières, we're talking very, very small percentage of people who look different at all. Like Trois-Rivières, 2.5% out of, 100,000. Even out here in the prairies, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, anywhere you want to go, that just doesn't exist anymore. Is it got anything to do with the language separation that has allowed this to carry on while it seems almost the entire rest of the country has become more diverse? How is this maintained?
Yeah, I don't think that the language necessarily plays into it because, the French-speaking world is diverse, is extremely diverse. It's as diverse as the English-speaking world. And so it's not as if French speakers in the world are white or anything like that. And as I say, it rivals Guelph, which is a Canadian city, and St. John's, which is a Canadian city as well. So I think that there's also, it's easy to forget that Quebec doesn't have that many big cities. Like that was one thing that I was shocked by when I moved here. I grew up in Ontario, and Ontario has 15 major cities. And then you get here and it's only 4. Yeah. And 3 of those major cities are Montreal, Laval, and Gatineau, right? Which are diverse, which are quite diverse. Montreal plays a big role because if you immigrate to Quebec, it's less likely that you want to live in a monocultural outpost like Quebec City than Montreal, which is a world-class city. It's a huge pull. It would be like trying to get people in Alberta to not settle in Edmonton and Calgary, right? Like it's there's a lot of economic factors for why people want to settle in Montreal. And then, of course, there's political resistance to immigration, although it's not as if the immigration levels have dropped yet. That's a discussion that's happening right now. But Montreal is one of the most diverse cities in the world. And so that's the portal for a lot of immigrants to come to Canada through Montreal. And there's not really any incentive for them to leave. And then, talking about the job market, like we've got a crisis of skills, of a skills shortage in this province, and the unemployment rate in Quebec City is something like 3%. Like it is very low, but the wages are really low too. And so you look at a lot of the jobs that are hiring, and they're in the service industry or the tourism industry, and they expect you to be able to speak at least one language, at least French, if not more than French. I've seen jobs posted at $11 an hour for trilingual workers. So, and that's one of the problems with running an entire industry, a city's industry off of tourism, right? So you got the public service, which is a good place to work, and they do recruit internationally, and at least there's a little bit of equity hiring that's built into the public service, and the government has levers to do more. If the CAQ government isn't necessarily talking about that, but one of the political parties in the last election was talking about that, Quebec solidaire. But the tourism industry is a really brutal industry. It's low union rates, low wages, terrible hours. And you're expected to be able to speak very, very good French. And as I say, usually more than one language of the tourists that come here. So there's a lot of barriers to accessing the job market. There's no question about that. And it's hard to live here if you don't speak French. So, or if you speak French with accented French. I have friends who don't understand what I say sometimes, and I just can't believe that they don't understand what I say, until I remember that, a lot of them really don't have any contact with accented French. It's a real problem. And the only way to make that problem better is with, government coordinated programs to make sure that immigration increases, that integration is possible, and that people have help.
I will agree, because of my time in Montreal and Laval, I found out that my français parisien didn't quite cut it sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, you have to learn what Québécois is. Now, well before January 29, 2017, Muslims and racialized people in Quebec City have been under what you called a steady and sustained attack. Mm-hmm. I remember this in 2016, a tourist from Toronto wearing a turban was attacked during Easter weekend. And in court, it was found that that was racially motivated. But yet, this time of year, bonhomme is everywhere, smiling, welcoming people. Right. Is there any reluctance in Quebec City, as you mentioned, because tourism is such a big thing? Is there a fear municipally that we'll try and keep this, we won't ignore it, but we won't full-on deal with it either because this may hurt the industry? Is there any of that going on?
I would say that's hard. It would be hard for me to say that yes to that question, because if you look at the way that the mayor, for example, has reacted to the rise of the far right, how he has reacted and the actions that he has taken since January 29, 2017, people here were very disturbed by it. I mean, I don't want to at all suggest that racism isn't a problem and isn't a factor in all of the different ways that it exists in the city, because I'm not suggesting that. But because tourism is such a big part of the city, I would say that there are other issues that people are frustrated with about tourism, and racism doesn't tend to really be in that discussion. Like, you'll hear the discussions about Airbnb far more than you'll hear about racism within the tourism industry.
Now, one of the things that I did a show about at the time when it was happening was Bill 62.
Right.
Now, I understand, through reading other things and through talking to the few people that I know in La Belle Province, but there seems to be a lot of talk, but very little action. I mean, Bill 62 was about forbidding women who wear the niqab from accessing public services, but yet research suggested there were fewer than 100 women who wear niqabs in all of Quebec.
And that's a high estimate.
So what exactly is the point of pushing this stuff through that, if you look at it objectively, it's got to be pretty xenophobic, but yet there's no real purpose to it? Is it just for politics?
Yeah, so Bill 62 was the kind of the result of the Liberal Party election victory in 2014. And so in 2014, after an 18-month government of the Parti Québécois and Premier Pauline Marois, they got elected on the wave of the students ousting Jean Charest and the Liberal government that had been in power since 2003. And rather than doing all the things that they had promised that they would do during that election, which they had a lot of really good social promises, they made that 18 months focus on what they called the Values Charter, which was supposed to be a document that kind of explained how Quebec is an atheist state, or is a state that is not religious, and that all Quebecers have these shared values. And it was a racist document and a xenophobic document, and was pretty much the reason that that they lost their minority government in April 2014, and the Liberals won. And so Bill 62 was the response of the Liberals to the whole Charter of Values stuff, because while they were opposed to the Charter of Values, they also were playing a similar political game, because it's like anywhere in Canada, you can win on xenophobia if the conditions are right. Yeah. And so the Liberals brought that up. Now, they brought that up at first. I think the first time it was moved was 2015, and it didn't actually get to committee or to be seriously debated until near the end of the Liberal mandate. And by then, the wheels were falling off the Liberal machine. And of course, what ended up happening was Bill 62 didn't get passed into law. There was a lot of questions about how enforcement would happen and what public services that were never answered. And, they never got reelected. And I suspect the CAQ is not going to really... they've got other ways to go after this issue than through something similar to the Values Charter or to Bill 62. It'll be looking at the Bouchard-Taylor recommendations and forbidding women that wear hijab from teaching, which is a whole other issue. But that was the last stand of the Liberals on the identity issues, and it didn't really help them. But it is important to see that in the outgrowth of what happened with the Parti Québécois in 2014.
Well, I just find it a little interesting. I mean, this exists elsewhere in Canada. I think of Toronto as being an absolute beacon for this sort of thing. But I've heard about Quebec City's talk radio world. Mm-hmm. I've heard that it kind of makes Calgary and a little further southwest Ontario, outside of Toronto, I've heard that it pales by comparison to those. Is it really that vitriolic every day on Quebec City Radio?
Great question. I've always been interested in this question as well, because I know how bad talk radio can get in Toronto. I'm not sure it's worse, to be honest. I think that what makes it worse is that it's way more popular, and that there's a style of monologue here that in Toronto talk radio tends to get cut by traffic and weather, right? So you've got like every 15 minutes there's traffic and weather updates, and so that cuts how long you can have somebody just ranting on the radio. But here, like, the rants are long, and unlike in Toronto, where I believe the most popular morning show is Metro Morning, CBC Radio, the most popular morning show here is one of these stations. And so it's much more popular, it's much more widespread, and we're a city, Quebec City car ownership is one of the highest in the country. Car culture is very strong, and so talk radio has really been oriented towards that, where in other urban centers where there's like a better public transit network, you don't have as many people in their cars with nothing to do. So those kind of make the trash radio scene particularly potent. And of course, they've got their thumb on what's going on the far right. And so they're able to tango with it in a way that keeps their hands clean, offers that kind of link with mainstream politics, whether it's the politics of the CAQ or the politics of the Parti Québécois. It kind of depends, because they're definitely opposed to the social democratic policies of the old Parti Québécois. But they are very effective in manipulating the political reality from the far right to the center to be popular and to be broadcast into the ears of a lot of folks. Like, Quebec City bus drivers are allowed to have the radio on while they're driving, which is not something I experienced in any other city before. I don't know if that's normal where you're from, but I often hear Radio X played in the bus. It's like, what?
That's kind of like you hear reports of people going to their doctor's offices in the States and they have to watch Fox News.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And again, I don't know if it's because they really like what they're hearing, or if it's just like, well, I'm driving on the road and you don't want to hear the same song repeated 5 times, and so you listen to talk radio.
Well, that kind of leads me to the next thing I want to ask. In your article, you mentioned the talk radio world and how it helped normalize and draw out members of organizations that are explicitly anti-Muslim and white supremacist, like Pegida Québec or La Meute. More and more, they started showing up. And isn't it kind of like a loop? They get more support. They appeal to the demographics and the advertising of the radio. They increase the content that's focused, and all of a sudden profits go up. Hey, this is a great system. Is this still going on? Is it getting worse, or it's just constant?
I would say it's a constant. It's not quite a feedback loop. I would say it's more of an ecosystem. It's part of the ecosystem here. They all feed off of one another, and they all create space for one another in different ways. There's no doubt that there's a connection between the talk radio world and the CAC getting elected in Quebec City. That being said, there's also no question that there's a connection between the CAC getting elected and people being really angry at the old parties, which isn't necessarily tied to the talk radio world. So it's definitely a peculiar aspect of this city. It's probably linked to how monocultural it is, as in everybody likes the same things, everybody listens to the same things. On the nights of the Festival d'été, the big summer festival here, where there's some sort of like old American metal band playing on the Plains of Abraham, like everybody in the city looks the exact same, wearing the exact same metal T-shirts. It is unbelievable. It is so funny to see how monocultural it really is. And it's hard because when you are of that culture, you don't see it as easily, right? Regardless of your intentions, regardless of your political orientation. And, you know, as someone not from here, that is ask where I'm from, literally every time I open my mouth every single day, if I'm talking to someone I've never met, it's hard not to see it. In fact, it's impossible not to see it. And so the way that influences politics here can be very difficult to understand, especially if you don't understand French. Even if you understand French, it can be still very difficult to see. You know, the fact that people here are just as oriented towards what's going on in France as they are what's going on in the United States. That's also something we don't have similar orientation in English Canada. We don't look to England the way that Quebecers look to France to look at what's going on, because we don't have that same kind of, I don't know, interest or connection, or if you look at immigration, like the highest number of immigrants in Quebec City, they come from France, right? So there's just also a bigger presence of France and French culture in Quebec than we have in the rest of Canada, where we're completely oriented to the United States. And of course, the United States is also a big focus here too.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing in this article, you recognized the emergence, the visibility of these antisocial, to be polite, groups, but you also said there's been a reaction. It's been a lot more forceful and visible with organizing against the rising tide of hate. Is that happening to this day? Is it carrying on in Quebec City?
Yes, it is carrying on, and we're just before the second anniversary vigil. It looks different than last year's vigil. I don't know what the turnout's going to be, although, you know, turnout's always defined by a lot of different factors, and last year the weather played a huge factor in how many people came out, and this year we've decided to do it indoors, so we'll see how that changes things. But the organizing, specifically with a focus on anti-racism, yes, it has continued and it is visible. In fact, there's a poster campaign right now of a lot of community groups, including groups that are mostly focused on housing activism, housing rights. They're doing a poster campaign against racism, which is not something that I had seen before, and I'm not sure is something that would have necessarily been a campaign in and of itself from these groups whose primary concern is looking at housing. So that's really encouraging, and attitudes are changing. Like the debate around religious symbols is a really interesting one, because I know people whose position has changed rapidly and fundamentally since I first met them just 6 years ago. And it's a change that I don't have a point of reference for in English Canada, where I've not seen a social movement change positions on the left so quickly on something. And so I think that that's really fascinating and encouraging, and really does show that a lot of the reason that things are the way they are simply thanks to the fact that it's such a closed and cloistered place to live.
Well, I find it interesting that I think it's a surprise for everybody in the place they live, where something that's not desirable starts to gain momentum, and then almost by a quid pro quo, all of a sudden there is a lot more opposition than anybody knew existed. I mean, everybody in Canada thinks that Calgary must be the biggest redneck shithead location in the entire country. But I live in Edmonton, and when I go to protests in Calgary, there may be a lot of Harper Vistas in Calgary, but the anti-fascism, the anti-globalism, neoliberalism crowd in Calgary is quite larger than the one in Edmonton, and Edmonton's the provincial capital. So do you think that's just Canadian nature, that people are going to say, hey, wait a minute, it's time to do something about this? Because in your article, you mentioned how people came out against who hadn't really ever been involved in a discussion before.
Yeah. I mean, I think that every city has its own stereotypes, and you say that about Calgary, and it's funny because I'm sure that there's people that think that, But I also know that anybody that's been to Calgary, which is a lot of people, know it's not like that too, right? Like we're a country, we don't talk enough in English Canada about the vast differences that do exist from region to region. And I'm not talking about the stereotypes, but just how culture is different in Saskatoon than it is in London, Ontario. And I saw that because I was a student organizer. And so I've organized on campuses in every region of this country and have seen that close up. I'm quite lucky to have had that experience, that background. And I'm also someone who's got roots in completely different parts of Ontario. And so I understand a little bit more the differences of perspective of someone from the north versus someone from the south, and neither from Toronto. And I've also lived in Toronto. And so I remember having a conversation with classmates of mine in Saskatoon about what Canadian culture is. And it was just so funny because the conversation started off very quickly like, well, of course there's Canadian culture. And literally within 10 minutes, they were like scratching their heads to name what a national unifying cultural touchstone is, right? Like once you get the most obvious, ridiculous examples out of the way, like Timbits and hockey. So it's very funny, and we have national myths, but those myths don't result in the sum of a culture, that our cultural differences are very, very, very strong and are very related to where we are from in Canada. But in English, we never explore them. And so French Canada looks totally bizarre to us English Canadians because we assume that our experience from Toronto or from Ottawa or from Winnipeg or from London is the exact same, regardless of where we're from, even though it's not. And then we overestimate how different culture is in Quebec. Now, there's obviously some different cultural aspects of Quebec, of the Quebec world, but they're not that different, I would say. The way that they're employed is not that different. And at the end of the day, every place in this country has more good people than shitty people,
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. But I guess, as you well know, and as I know to a certain degree, getting those people to become involved is not always the easiest task. It's unfortunate that it takes events like the Sainte-Foy shooting to get people out.
I mean, to some extent, but that's also just kind of a commentary about where political organizing is right now, right? Because how do you organize around something if there's nothing being done to organize around it, right? The horrible thing about the shooting was that it took a moment like that for people to be shaken out of a way of thinking. And trying to organize some of the anti-racist or solidarity actions before that event, like I was shocked at how much, not resistance, but well, it was resistance, but not active resistance. There was like this weird passive resistance to trying to organize on the basis of anti-racist solidarity among a lot of people who I knew who are like politically progressive and good people. And unfortunately, it was a moment that was so horrible that really had to bring people together, which is not acceptable, except that's what's happened. So, at least there has been something like that's happened.
Well, Nora, it's good to hear that motivation and mobilization are taking hold. As we've said, it's too bad that it takes a tragedy to do it, but it is happening, and it's good to hear that it's carrying on. But the Sainte-Foy shooting is not, unfortunately, not an isolated incident, as much as we would like it to be. In April of last year, you wrote a piece called "Violence Rarely Comes from Nowhere," and it was basically about the Alex Manassian attack in Toronto, which was motivated by hatred of women. I think this is one of the first times that little word incel popped into the mainstream. As we've established, Toronto is very different from a place like Quebec City, but Toronto is also much, much larger, as you said. And people do look different everywhere you turn in Toronto. That's what Toronto is. That is Toronto. But do you think that makes a different dynamic for the people like Alex Manassian, that is a frustrated millennial, has basically no education, can't afford an education, can't keep a job, too much time on his hands, and he gets radicalized? Is that like a whole nother environment from Quebec City?
No, I actually think it's quite similar to Quebec City. It's just that there's factors that are playing them out in a different way. I mean, this extreme antisocial behavior comes when there's a problem with how society's social solidarity networks exist. And everywhere in Canada, neoliberalism has destroyed community supports, community identity, community resilience. And so it's quite easy for people to feel like they're completely isolated and cut off from their community. Add on top of that, if they're sick, if they're physically or mentally ill, finding supports and long-term ways to address those issues can be very difficult. And add also to that, all of the responsibility to help that individual falls on the family members or maybe close friends. And there's not a lot that people say that they can or they can't do. Because, with Minassian, like, first of all, we actually don't know very much about what he did or why he did what he did. There hasn't been any court evidence presented that's been reported, which is just such a shame because we're coming up so quickly already to the first anniversary of that.
Yeah.
But there's also the Danforth shooter, and more information has come out about him too. And it sounds like he also was motivated by similar experiences. Alexandre Bissonnette, it came out in his sentencing hearing for Alexandre Bissonnette that he went to a mall armed to carry out his attack at a mall before he decided to do it at the mosque. And so, again, this is antisocial behavior, and it's an attack on a community. On which community is that? In Minassian's case, it was women, and in Bissonnette's case, it was Muslims. But in some cases, the identity of the people that they're targeting is just a stand-in for all of the ways that they believe society has mistreated them, failed them, hurt them, or whatever. And understanding that's important, because if we're going to talk about the solution going forward, we have to understand that. And so in Quebec City, the way that we've tried to move forward is to talk about living well together and to make sure people meet each other and understand and see difference and be okay with difference, rather than shutting ourselves off from difference, refusing to change this monocultural society, refusing and demonizing people that want to come here, either if they're desperate to come here as refugees or they want to come here as immigrants or from even outside of the province. Like, it's also very difficult just to move here from the rest of Canada. And so there's a lot of similar lessons in all of these experiences. The one thing that made Minassian stand out in a way that I wrote about him was the sheer hatred that he seemed to have for women, and his indiscriminate killing of them, compounded by all of the problems that exist within the GTA, the housing crisis, the education cost crisis, the lack of mental health supports, the fact that he had clearly fallen into the cracks, that he was in the military and they never identified him as someone that should have, maybe been taken aside, given extra help or whatever, right? It just seemed like he was at the center of a perfect storm of failures. And as they say, there's parallels that you can draw with a couple of parallels that you can call Alexandre Bissonnette. But I actually think that there's more parallels that you can draw with someone like Bruce McArthur, who was this serial killer who preyed on mainly queer, racialized men in Toronto. Again, failure after failure of the system allowed McArthur to cause maximum injury.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point when you put it that way. It is the same base motivations or lack of supports, but in a place like Toronto compared to Quebec City. Yeah, I can see how much more wound up everything is. You go from just into 6 digits in Quebec City for population to 4 million proper for Toronto.
Yeah.
So does that also add another factor that it's just multiplicative? When you have that many more people, there's going to be that many more people susceptible to this, and it makes it easier for them to coalesce? Is the online usage of people in, say, Quebec City lower than people in Toronto? Is that also a factor?
I don't know. Like, we know a lot about Bissonnette, his online world. He was obsessed and focused on American politics. And so the thing about the online world is that if someone's struggling, they can find people to reinforce what they're struggling with rather than help them deal with it. And that it doesn't matter where you live for that to happen. It can be a large city or it can be a small isolated town, that those communities are just as accessible one to the other. What maybe would be different in a large city like Toronto, although keep in mind that Quebec City is still a capital city, so we still are the center of services, unlike a lot of the parts of the regions in the province. But you would think that in a city like Toronto, that's where you'd be able to get the supports and the help that you might need. But I think that a lot of people also look at a city like Toronto and see it as such a success story of diversity and of people living together well, that there's a lot of people in and outside of Toronto that are surprised to find out that there's white nationalist organizing that's happening in Toronto. And there always has been.
Well, I think anywhere that has Faith Goldie running for mayor, I think it would be self-evident.
Now it is. But, I was organizing on campus in 2005, 2006, and was the target of white supremacists in Toronto. And I can't tell you how many people refused to believe that it was actual neo-Nazis that were targeting me, like despite the fact that there are pictures of Hitler and stuff, and the comments were all very, very clear where they're coming from. But people were like, how could you be a neo-Nazi living in the city of Toronto? And it's like, it's because racism is everywhere in this country. Like, racism is the foundation of Canada. And you can choose to see it or not, depending on if you're white. And if you are white and you choose not to see it, then you're literally ignoring the systemic proof, the anecdotal proof, the proof that is literally around you in every single thing that you do on a daily basis. And a lot of people do choose to live like that, and it's too bad because we need those people to not live like that, to open their eyes to what's happening, to be comfortable in getting involved to fight it without being resistant to it or defensive or whatever else stops people from getting involved, or of course people actually being involved in right-wing movements. That's a whole other kind of person that we need to figure out how to reach and pull away from these communities however we can. And that becomes the responsibility of those of us who might be friends or family members or neighbors with these kinds of people. And that is the kind of work that you should be doing regardless if you live in a large city like Toronto or if you live in a tiny community anywhere else in this country.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, radicalization has become a buzzword, but it does exist, and it is the base factor in drawing people into these radical movements. I know at one of the press conferences, I think it was the second one, about what Manassian did, a reporter asked, should we try preventing incidents like this because they're random after all? Do you think that there's a certain desensitization that naturally happens when these events continue? Is there fear that, as we see in the United States with mass shootings, I mean, the shooting in Florida, I didn't even see it on Twitter. And usually Twitter has everything.
Right.
Is there a danger of Canada following the U.S. on that matter if we don't mobilize soon enough, that if these things do start to propagate, people will start to accept them? Or do you think that's outside the Canadian mindset?
Oh, I don't think there's anything that's outside the Canadian mindset. I think that if something happens in the United States, a good chance that Canadians would be completely open to it happening here. It might just take a different form. But it's an interesting question. Like, do we just have to accept that a certain level of violence is going to happen within a society? And I suspect that the person that asked that question is a man. And the reason why I suspect that, although correct me if you happen to know and if I'm wrong, the reason why I suspect that is because I cannot accept that a random attack is even random when it's targeted against women, right? It's not as if there's a level of random, evenly spread out crime in this country. If we had some sort of crime that happened to everybody, then you can say, oh, well, car accidents. Aren't car accidents inevitable? Isn't this just part of driving? Isn't this just something we have to get used to? And even car accidents, you can actually look at the data and say, no, they're still not inevitable. They're still not totally random. But in a targeted attack like Manassian or Bissonnette or Marc Lépine with the École Polytechnique shooting, none of that's random. They were targeting people. And so for someone to even imagine to say, don't we have to accept some sort of level of violence? As a woman, am I supposed to accept some level of violence? There will be some sort of unstoppable man that just has to kill women? Like, no, I can't accept that. But unfortunately, that kind of normalization does happen by people who don't see these things as being extremely linked with how society treats, in this case, women, or with how society treats Muslims, or how society treats any group of people that are not in the majority. So the difference, I think, in the United States is that you see a lot of mass shootings that are related to families, which is like horrible and is a different kind of problem. I think that if you have guns as widespread as the United States, shootings are something that all of a sudden people get used to, like especially toddler shootings, right, which just seems completely unbelievable to me. We have gun violence problems in this country. And, Quebec is the only province right now with a gun registry. And the gun registry here is still very controversial. And actually, the deadline to register your guns is January 29th. It's coming up this Tuesday. And so we can either look at crime as inevitable and as something that's always going to happen, or we can say, wait a minute, there's actually factors that we could change to not make these things inevitable and to actually stop them from happening or change how they happen to make things less violent or less difficult. Right? Again, to the car accident example, people probably thought that car accidents and murder and deaths by car were normal and inevitable because they didn't have seatbelts. And then all of a sudden you got seatbelts, and so the accident rate goes through the roof of people getting injured, but they're not dying anymore because they're being held into the car. Right? There's always ways to make things better, and as a society, we absolutely need to strive to make things as best as we can.
Bravo, I absolutely agree with that. And yes, you were correct. The reporting asking the question was male.
How? Just so great that I can guess this stuff, eh?
Something else you brought up in this article was the part about urban planning, about, at the time, Jennifer Keesmaat, as the manager for the city of Toronto, said that maybe we should be taking a look about keeping medium or high rate speed far, far away from where people congregate. Is that a hard engineering fix for some of these things? Does that remove the availability of a lot of targets if this would become part of city planning?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm not sure that you want to necessarily have city planners be considering that the way to solve someone committing a mass tragedy is only through city planning. But the thoroughfare up at Yonge and Sheppard, if you're not familiar with it, it is really right off of the 401, and people drive as if they're still on the 401. And so you've got a city street where people are driving as if they're on a 400 series highway, which is, 120 is a normal speed. So there are absolutely ways that we can deal with some of the urban planning issues that related to pedestrian deaths, right? In the city of Toronto, 96 people died last year in pedestrian deaths. And so, we can talk about how do we stop another Alec Manassian from happening through urban planning, or we could just look at the fact that 98 people died in pedestrian deaths in the city of Toronto and say, okay, what else is the problem here? What else is going on here? And it's like, oh, maybe it's our obsession with cars in a city that was not built to take that kind of volume of car traffic.
That's a very good point, and I see a parallel there in a way with the Sainte-Foy incident, because that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But there's all kinds of other things that have been going on for years. There was the severed pig's head. There was all kinds of things prior to that event. And as you're saying here, yes, Manassian did what he did, but there's also all these other people being killed on the streets. So should we really be so outraged? This problem has been there and nobody's done anything about it.
I mean, I think there, I don't ever get mad that people get outraged about stuff that's mundane, because I think, a lot of what is mundane is unacceptable, and I'm happy with people being outraged, right? Outrage is an important aspect of existence. But one of the things that I experienced right after that the news broke that I think original reports were 7, I think, people had been hit without a list of how many people had been killed. I said something like that car accidents in Toronto are just so mundane that it's unbelievable that we've normalized this. And I was still in the ire of an international social media storm at that point. And so I think some unbelievable number of people attacked that tweet. A lot of people came after me for saying that such a tragedy was mundane. But of course, it was partly a literacy issue that people were choosing not to understand what mundane means, which is that we accept, again, a certain number of pedestrian deaths as being life with cars. And it's not like that at all. It's not inevitable. And if you live in Toronto, you know very, very well how dangerous it can be to be on the road. I was a long-distance cyclist for 5 years of the 10 years I lived there, and every single morning I came into my office having just avoided a brush with actual death. And so when something like Manassian happens with something that, with a weapon that is used all the time to hurt people, but without the political orientation that he had, so people hurt people with cars all the time, it should cause us pause to say, well, maybe we also have a problem with cars. Maybe we also have a problem with the speed of cars on our roads. And while that's not a fix to what happened in that case, because that was a targeted killing, there's other fixes, as I mentioned in that article, that we could consider. We do have to think about the availability of these sorts of weapons. And why don't we even think of cars in the sense of being a weapon? Why is the maximum penalty under the Highway Traffic Act in Ontario like a fine of under $1,000? It's unbelievable. That's maximum. So you kill someone under the Highway Traffic Act, you're going to pay under $1,000, and that is it. Unless you can prove that it was being used as a weapon, which in a lot of accidents you can't, right? We have big problems in this country related to cars and to car accidents. And I think part of it is just because we have such a lot of space that we see cars and our right to have cars as an inextricable part of our personal identities. That is something that unites all Canadians, English and French, regardless of where you're located, I think. And it makes it very difficult for us to have an adult conversation about replacing cars, because we absolutely need to replace cars. They're completely ridiculous. We had a snowstorm paralyze the city on the weekend, and cars were causing havoc to the buses because people are driving in and out, and there's only one lane. And I saw today someone almost get rear-ended by a bus because she slammed on her brakes because all of the ice that she didn't clean off of the roof of her car slid onto the windshield. It's just like, how is this efficient? This is not efficient. You get on the bus, you get off the bus. That is called efficiency. And that's actually called real freedom, right? Real freedom is not having to worry about your property and where you're keeping it. Is someone touching it? Is someone looking inside of what you've got there? Real freedom is you walk out of your door, you walk down the street, you get onto a bus. You don't have to worry about anything. You've got a professional driving you, and you have a network that services you. But we are so far away from that conception of freedom being reality that we have a long way to go.
Well, I think the motivation behind that is traditional income streams more than anything. I mean, Europe is far ahead of us as far as accepting that version of freedom. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how many people I've known that have gone to the continent and gotten a Europass for the rail and said it was just the absolute best way they could ever imagine traveling. Yeah. But that just seems so foreign to this continent, but that's another issue. But again, when we talk about Manassian and the research done and is basically empty resume, no education because of cost, among other factors. Yeah. There is so much brick walls put up, especially. That brings me around to who is, in my opinion, the globe's foremost bunk salesman. Yeah. Jordan Peterson. Now, before you wrote this column about Jordan Peterson, you admitted that, you didn't really know much about him. And then you decided to immerse yourself a little bit. How did you find that experience? I mean, in your article, you compared it to the Great Depression, where there were so many idle, angry men. And the army thought that they may become a security threat. And they tried to round them up in work camps to give them something to do and pay them slave wages. But it turned out they were nothing but organizing hubs. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we see how it can easily be built up. Not because these men were all radicals or anything, but because their entire lifestyle had been turned upside down and they felt worthless. I mean, we're talking the 30s here. If you don't earn money, what good are you? So it was the environment and the factors that drove the way it went. Now in the online world, Jordan Peterson seems to have found a holy grail of sorts for his own remuneration. But why are so many people of a certain demographic giving so much weight to this charlatan?
That's a great question, and that's kind of what motivated me to check out some of his writing. I was in a conversation with someone who I didn't know, and who just couldn't say enough good things about Peterson, and he sent me a famous interview that he did with a reporter from the BBC, where he was just like, Jordan Peterson killed this woman, yeah. And she walked into a bunch of his traps, and the whole interview became a viral sensation to show how smug and smart Jordan Peterson is. But I think that there's a lot of young people, and especially young men, who are looking for a messiah, who are looking for someone who can legitimize their pain, explain their pain, and give them simple ways to make the pain go away. And of course, like, Peterson is a snake oil salesman. He's not actually interested in doing these people any favors. The proof, of course, being in how much money he makes off of it. But that doesn't matter, because there's a lot of people who are in a lot of pain. And that pain goes back to the same forces that I talked about with Manassian. It's isolation. It's an inability to start your life. It's an inability to move out of your parents' place because it's too expensive. You can see these factors at play in so many different ways. And in the connection to the far right in that whole incel movement, but also to just a general malaise, right? It's like the job market is not great. People were lied to about taking on tons of student debt. And Peterson taps into all of that and just gives people this very easy dogma that effectively says, you clean your room, you get order over the things that you can control, you give out a good vibe, and women will come and find you attractive, and all of your problems will be solved.
As a man, I just chuckle when I hear that stuff. But that basically is it. In your article, I'm going to quote, "Self-help alone isn't dangerous, but it becomes dangerous in the way that Peterson uses it as the solution to the myriad problems that young people face. He argues that the left is dangerous and destructive because of the emphasis it places on quote-unquote group identity." Right. Now, in his video entitled "No Safe Space," Peterson argues that this group identity is really what killed tens of millions of people under Stalin's communism and Hitler's Nazism, and then remarkably concludes, and I'm concerned because the universities are so overwhelmed by this that I can't see how they can extract themselves from it. What utter bullshit. But
yeah, it's unbelievable.
Do you think there's any of a personal grudge that Peterson now has against the post-secondary system because he simply couldn't go off on this Hunter S. Thompson money march?
Oh, I mean, probably. I'm sure he's motivated to some extent to tell his former colleagues to eat a bag of garbage. I mean, it's just so intellectually dishonest, right? Like the idea that a single university has anything at all that resembles Stalinism or Nazism, it's like, it is so ridiculous. It's as if someone is walking around saying 5 and 5 make 11 and all these people are clapping to say this guy's brilliant. It's like, wow, there's such a lack of any kind of understanding, and the difference between a social theory versus actual political policy and history and what has happened. It's really stunning. And so I see Peterson as the radical status quo maintaining agent of the state, that he has managed to do more to make sure that young people stay away from communist ideas or socialist ideas than anybody else. And it's quite a feat because we know that these ideas are coming back. They're getting currency. There's young politicians that are talking about socialist ideas in a way that is quite popular because these ideas are popular. These are like socialism comes from popular uprising, right? Like it is so basic that states need someone like Jordan Peterson to fully isolate, demonize, obscure, change the channel, and then sick haters on proponents of these political ideas or these policies. It's brilliant. And if you see Peterson as serving that role, and he serves it, like I'm not saying he's being paid to serve it, but there's no question that he serves to maintain a radical expression of the status quo. It's just amazing that so many people fall for it. And I know why people fall for it. I talk about some of those factors, that there's this desperation that exists, but we need to be better collectively at identifying these forces.
I agree. And I'm going to quote from your article again, and I think this is right on point. Peterson's message fits perfectly with the prevailing ideology that has driven public policy debates in North America since the 80s. People should be able to succeed on their own without help from the state. And this message intentionally erases systemic barriers that remain and instead demonizes anyone who understands that collective advancement is the key to improvement. That's fact. That's empirical fact throughout civilization. Supremacy of the individual is the only way to stop global war and mass murder. So his sales pitch is you have to become this mythical individual and ignore all the systemic factors around you, and that's the only way you'll get ahead. I can see where that would work to create addicted consumers to your product because what you're telling them never changes anything. But at the same time, isn't this exactly what he should be being called out for? He's mythicizing and
greed and all of the things that actually drive society into the ground. Yeah. And we don't have a sophisticated enough journalist class to be able to call this out, or they're part of the status quo maintenance, like they're invested in it or they benefit from it, or their literal job is to obscure that aspect of this as well.
Now, Nora, in your article, you quoted Margaret Thatcher, which is something that I always remember. And she identified community as the enemy to neoliberal economic reforms. Yep. If we stop identifying with our neighbors, we lose empathy for them. We work together less. Now, when I first saw Peterson come onto the scene, as soon as I tried to decipher whatever Tony Robbins' message he was trying to get out, that's exactly what I heard, neoliberalism. And I agree with your position that he is nothing but a new language salesman for the status quo. And I think there's a lot of validity to what you say about why is the press so accommodating? Who are they really working with or for? But when babble like this becomes so influential, is there a way to directly combat it, or should it just be countered with new messages, not necessarily the same gobbledygook, but new messages from other perspectives need to go into the same spaces to fight this. Do you think there's a future in that?
I mean, the problem is that finding those spaces is really difficult, right? Like, there's an effective media ban on any perspective in Canada that is to the left of the NDP, and even the NDP has a difficult time getting its voice heard. And, you know, a lot of mainstream people will say, well, the NDP's not got its shit together and it's their fault and all this kind of thing. But there's a lot of people that do have their shit together to the left of the NDP who have stuff to say that is all backed up in statistics and in research and is completely credible. And there's an effective ban on that kind of talk. And so trying to find ways to go toe-to-toe with Jordan Peterson is very difficult because, you know, we're effectively shut out of a lot of the platforms that he has so successfully manipulated, right? Like, we're not going to get a 5,000-word blog post at the National Post, right? Like, and not like it's the National Post that's making him popular, because I'm sure that most of his audience doesn't give a rat's ass about the National Post. But it's just one example, right? Like, he's a tenured faculty member with a lot of freedom. He's now on like a second or third year of a leave. It's a platform that most people don't have access to. And so we can't compete with him on that level. We have to find other ways to be able to pierce through the messages that he delivers. And that's very hard, right? It's like, you know, the two Canadians that had best-selling books globally in the last year is him and Rupi Kaur. And Rupi Kaur, of course, the poet from Brampton, and her poetry is quite popular. And so it just seems like there's kind of like there's a way to become as popular as Jordan Peterson, but it's to like do something completely different to actually combat the message that Peterson has. It's very difficult because it's not really any publisher that's a mainstream publisher that's interested in publishing that. You can barely get your voice heard on the national, or you could barely get onto any of the provincial call-in shows as an expert. Like, it's really brutal actually out there for anybody whose perspective breaks with the right-wing neoliberal logic that has held Canada captive since Mulroney.
Well, I find it interesting that, you know, all those platforms that you mentioned, there are severe commonalities in ownership and political outlook of those groups. Gee, I'm sure that has nothing to do with it. But I think we'll agree that Peterson's not stupid. And when you talk about being able to go toe-to-toe with him, he's very, very loath to put himself anywhere where that can happen. Is that also correct?
Yeah, of course. Like, the guy's smart enough to not debate someone who's smarter than him, right? And there's also a huge lack of that in Canada, where we've got a lot of people that aren't that smart occupying our airwaves. And it's like, I think, you know, average people can kind of smell through that kind of smarmy, not smart at all, but astroturfing their intelligence kind of thing. And that it feeds a lot of resentment, right? You put someone who's actually smart in front of the camera or in front of a microphone, and you can actually start to see that a lot of the walls that are up between ideologies or ideologues kind of start to fall, because you can have a proper conversation where you're able to say, well, like, here are the fundamental points that we disagree, and then the question just becomes, what do you prefer among these fundamental points? But we don't have these kinds of debates in Canada. We have discussions about injustice. That discussions don't tend to go anywhere further than the pure discussion. That's kind of a Canadian pastime, is to talk about all of the problems that we have without doing anything about it. And a Peterson is only going to find himself across the microphone from someone who's not as smart as him, and so he'll either play them like a fiddle, or you'll never see him actually debate anybody smart. And that's not just Peterson. There's a lot of Canadian commentators who will not agree to talk to someone or debate someone who they know is smarter than them, because they might not be that smart, but they are smart enough to know that that's not going to be a good look.
Their brand awareness and their self-preservation is a higher level than perhaps their intelligence.
Oh, totally. And whose isn't, right? Like, our self-preservation gets us to eat breakfast in the morning, right? A critical skill that pretty much everybody has.
Well, I hope that this demagoguery can be limited. He seems to be cooling off a bit, but I guess all it takes is the next outrage or the next regrettable act to happen in society on the whole, and I'm sure he'll pop right back up. Like, do you think his phenomenon is over with?
No, I mean, I think that all of the attention that he's getting is probably over with for now, because there's also a bit of a flash in the pan aspect to him. But it's what he does and what he gives people that is the most important thing to keep your eye on. And so whether or not Peterson's Patreon is dropping, or whether or not he's fallen off the bestsellers list, or whatever, whether or not his crowds have gone from 2,000 to 1,500 is not really the important marker. The important marker is how is his currency among his audience, and is his audience growing? Is he reaching new and more people and newer people, or are some of his former fans able to speak out and say that they understand now that the guy was playing them and playing off of their economic insecurities or whatever, right? Like, there's metrics that we should be using to figure out what Peterson's reach is, and they aren't just basic metrics of popularity, because that guy's number one goal is to probably make sure that his bank account is as fat as possible. But his danger isn't in Peterson being a rich guy. Like, who cares how much money that Peterson's made from talks with young men or whatever? His danger is in creating political consensus or political hegemony in such a way that is very hard to undo or to call out. It's very brilliant. It's interesting. It's an interesting social phenomenon, and in absence of any left-wing balancing, counterposing voice at the same level or the same access to his platform, his influence is going to continue, unfortunately. Now, I have to say, I like that I haven't had to see a think piece about him in the last 6 months. And, I haven't had to write about him in the last 6 months. So there's obvious benefits to us not paying attention to the guy. But let's not kid ourselves that that's an indication that his ideas are becoming less popular. If anything, the proof that his ideas are popular can be seen in what Andrew Scheer talks about, in the fact that Maxime Bernier has a party, like a guy that has no business. He's a guy that probably can't feed himself breakfast in the morning and now has a political party, right? Like, those are the fruits that have come to bear thanks to someone like Peterson.
So I guess what you're saying is we should be hopeful that he is a narcissistic capitalist and he's more concerned about money than actually consolidating any real power.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I don't think that guy's taking, a job with the Conservative Party or anything, and he doesn't seem like a healthy dude either. So, like, who knows what his stamina is like to maintain a lifestyle that is not too sustainable, right? And you go on tour for 75% of a year, it's going to take your toll on anybody. But again, this isn't about Peterson. I could care less if Peterson made tons of money or didn't make tons of money, but his popularized ideas, those are dangerous. Those are really dangerous. And especially this idea that all of World War II was about identity politics. It's like the amount of ignorance that it takes for a position like that to even be said with a straight face is stunning. But the guy hates communism and won't really stop to think about how ridiculous that position is or isn't, because he's making some money off of it and he's convincing people with lies, basically.
And what blows me away is his general number one demographic is supposedly the most educated generation we've ever had.
Yeah. I mean, I just saw a New York Times article say that fewer than 50% of Canadians know any details about the Holocaust. Like, we are in, we're the millennial generation, and then after us are the result of the generation that came after the information superhighway, where all the information that we've ever had blows any period of history out of the water. We have so much knowledge. And we know so little about history that of course, you're going to see this factor into who we vote for, how we talk about politics, what are the policies that excite people and what don't excite people, and what are the rhetorical devices that people use that they should never have been able to use if the lessons of any of the world wars or the Holocaust actually took a place in anybody's mind. But of course, these events happened with the help of power because they're about geopolitical war, right? Like, geopolitical war is not going to be stopped because people know about it. Like, people were around, existed in World War II, and it still happened, right? World War I was supposed to end it all, and it still happened, and World War led directly to World War II. So, we have this myth that it's through knowledge that these things will never happen again, and that we are knowledgeable and educated, and therefore they can never happen again. But of course, it's not knowledge that stops this stuff. It's political power from the people. But those are the lessons that have been sanitized out of our history. And so if you are even getting the history, if you are the half the Canadian population that gets any of the history of the Holocaust, for example, you likely have no idea about the political forces that led to that. That the Nazis were never elected, or what hyperinflation is, or whatever, right? Like all of the important background pieces that led to the rise of a figure like Adolf Hitler. And you look what's going on in the United States right now. It's like, wow, we really could use both that historical knowledge that people need to have, like the popular knowledge of what happened, but also the subversive knowledge that has been actively suppressed.
I think it's also important that those who are aware, and hopefully that grows more and more, it's not just Peterson himself. It's those who will become the torchbearers, those who will think, hey, I'm 15 years younger than him. I know how his shit works. Why don't I cash in? I think that's a very real possibility in any sort of movement that happens these days because of the availability of it, because of the relative ease of it. It always helps if you've got friends, but I mean, again, you look at the U.S., you got people like Jacob Wohl and all these 20-something smart-ass Ivy League boys who are getting rich talking bullshit. Canada doesn't really have any of them yet. Ezra tried, but do you think it's, I mean, I agree with you that whatever happened in the U.S., wait 8 or 10 years, it'll happen in Canada.
Yeah.
Do you think that's still coming? We haven't seen that yet?
I'm not sure if it's all about making money. I think that things operate a little bit different in Canada in that having access to power is just as good currency as making tons of money. But, I'm not sure that I would ignore the Ontario Prouds of the world in this conversation. Like we kind of do have that already. It just takes a different form, as everything. I don't know if the guys behind Ontario Proud are making any money off of it, or maybe they're making tons of money off of it. We know that they were given a lot of money to run that site, so they probably made some money, and they're giving contracts to themselves, so they've made some money that way. But are they getting like ridiculously rich off of it, or are they just, being the handmaidens of Satan in getting people elected who have no business being elected? Their reward seems to be the latter. And I think that that's a more important aspect to this, like their influence in, again, hegemonic change, changing the social consciousness, collective understanding of what's going on in the world. And they've done it very well, partly thanks to how the Liberals governed in various parts of this country, through schemes or through helping their friends or through patronage or through scandal. And it's just enough to completely isolate and anger average people who can smell a scheme and can smell that they're being taken for a ride. And there's not a strong left-wing alternative in a lot of the parts of this country for people to get caught up by. And so then they get caught up in the rhetoric of the Ontario Prouds of the world, whose fucking slogan, it was the same as Jeremy Corbyn's, right? It's like, it's unbelievable.
Yep.
And it's very smart and it's very cynical. And a lot of people are going to be hurt by their own actions and their own political decisions.
Yeah, I would compare that to the bastardizing and theft of the Yellow Vest movement from the Gilets jaunes in France compared to the idiots we see trying to latch onto it here in Canada. But again, when you look at the centralized nexus of operations, there's certainly a pattern here. Do you think there's any lack of attention being paid to these base methodologies that are obviously happening in Canada like everywhere else, and there's just absolutely no desire to cover it by any of the corporate media? Is that also contribute to the sleepwalking into look south of the 49th?
Yeah, I think probably, but it's also like this stuff is very complicated, right? Like it would take a lot of minds deep diving into how Facebook, for example, interacts with a group like Never Again Canada or Canada First or all of these right-wing groups. And I don't know of anybody doing that kind of work in a substantive way. I know that there's individuals and individual writers and activists that are paying attention to these groups and watching them, but there's no data analysis that's coming out that is saying this threshold, you're bounced into this algorithm, and then all of a sudden your page becomes a magnet for other people that then plays with the Facebook algorithm and then keeps putting it into people's feeds. Then you have a feedback loop. Yeah. I just had a post come out for the organization that I work for, the Canadian Association of Labor Media, that is a labor minute, a history minute on the Frank Slide, which is an event you might know of.
Yep.
It's not groundbreaking. It's a post that we commissioned 25 years ago that we were like, hey, let's put this on Facebook and see how it goes. And it's gone viral. Like our views shot up 4,000%. And it's like, okay, now we're getting messages from people, and the messages don't actually refer to the post, and they don't make much sense. And then you go to the people's page who's sending us these messages, and they're from outside of Canada, and a lot of them have far-right material on their page. And it's like, wait, why are you on a union web page from Canada sending me messages that are in all caps about those poor men with weird typos in them that suggest that you're actually a machine and not a person? And so I'm seeing this on one post where the post got a little bit viral from what's normal, and then all of a sudden these fake accounts are flooding it, and then it's continuously being pushed into people's feeds, and then other people are coming in saying, oh, remember the Frank slide? Oh, we vacationed there. Oh, I have pictures of it. And this is this confluence of real people and fake people commenting on a post that there's no magic behind it. It's something that people are interested in. It's, an interesting part of Canadian history, of labor history. And you can just see how this world of fake accounts get whipped into this. Now, it's innocuous because for the Canadian Association of Labor Media, we don't really need the page clicks, and the page isn't monetized, and doesn't give us anything other than a lot of people got to see a cool story. But when you put that into a movement of people that are trying to take over the yellow vests or anti-immigrant movements or racist movements or white supremacist movements, you can see the power in that, because then all of a sudden they have 100,000 members. You don't know if 100,000 members are real. You go to these people's pages and they look kind of real. Like there's a woman and that's the same picture twice, and then that's kind of it, right? She's got all these filters on her things for Merry Christmas or Keep Christ in Christmas or whatever the fuck. I mean, we don't know about this enough. There's no one that I'm aware of doing this research. And if they are doing this research, it's not getting out publicly enough. And I guess the final thing I'll say on this is, I was at the center of one of these hurricanes after a tweet that I wrote related to the money raised in the Humboldt bus tragedy went viral. And no one has asked me for the data. No one's asked me for all of the information that I saved from that. No one has asked me to study how exactly that went as viral as it went. And I just think that's so fascinating, because it's like it could have driven me to suicide. It literally could have driven me to suicide. That was the goal of that campaign. And they contacted all my family. They contacted everybody with my last name, my employer. They tried to isolate me. They tried to scare me. People did threaten my life. And not only has no one asked me for any of the data to even go through it and mine it and see what's there, but there's been no stories about it. No one's written about it. No one has asked me. There was two professors have asked me. Two professors wrote a thing about what I said, challenging national myths, and that being important discussion. But the way that was used to try and silence me is a huge red flag for how this machine treats critics and treats the left wing. And I just think that is so weird that no one noticed. Average people notice, but no one with the power to actually study this stuff and say, okay, what is the impact on our democracy if this is the kind of thing that happens to an individual who says something that's not even controversial and is completely true? What happens when Canada gets our Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moment? Or what happens when there's some sort of movement? We're so unprepared for this. It's really shocking.
Well, I was totally going to leave that up to you, whether you even brought that up. But as far as that incident goes, I fully agree with what you said. I think it's truth. I think it's demonstrable. I just think that part of it was that's a sacred cow that too many people who aren't anywhere near living in this decade got exposed to. And as you said, how did they become exposed to it is a real issue. As far as any forensic or preventative measures not being launched or requested or anything else, I think that's pretty indicative of there's no money in it. That's what I see the biggest thing is. And that's really unfortunate, but, and it's certainly not shocking, because I've been on this one for years now. It doesn't matter what you have to say or how much truth is in it. Can we make money off it if we promote it? It seems to be the overwhelming sentiment for transitory items. In the 15-minute or 15-second news cycle, it seemed to me that somebody figured it out, that there was a lot of revenue to be generated by twisting what you said. That's one thing. The other thing is the institutional level of reaction that you got to it and the malice of the intent of it. It's not right by any stretch, but as a third person, and not to, make it sound less than it was, unfortunately, I'm not surprised that there's absolutely no voice other than your own that says, hey, this shouldn't happen. Because, again, to look at the other side of the coin, which is obviously much heavier than the first side, look at the stuff here in Alberta and nationally with that Jason Kenney, about how he may have misappropriated a residence allowance. Mm-hmm. And, oh my God, he's a victim. He's a victim. This guy's lived off the public tit for decades, part of a government that manufactured every dime out of the system they could while bitching that government costs too much. But yet he gets the immediate shield. And nobody wants to talk about the truth. Now all of a sudden it's about people shouldn't be attacking this man like this. Mm-hmm. But what he's tolerating is nowhere near what you had to tolerate, and that there's absolutely no impetus to do anything about it. So I guess what I want to ask is, do you think that what happened to you will not be an isolated incident? It's going to happen again to somebody else.
Oh, no question it will. And this is actually my main point. Like, I don't care that very few people publicly supported me, that no one stuck their neck out. Like, a lot of the people who did support me did so with the support of other people, right? There wasn't any, like, it was a massive attack on free expression in this country. And I got a lot of private messages of support, which were great. But let's just say, like, the public support was lacking. But that, I don't even care about that. Like, I'm almost a year from that moment now, and I don't really expect people to do anything brave anymore. But my answer was more to the question about, are we ready to stop these kinds of online movements, or online movements like the Yellow Vest movement, or like a lot of these right-wing movements that organize themselves on Facebook? And the fact that people aren't even interested in studying what happened to me as if it wasn't practice for the next time is what I'm so shocked by. Because you're right that there might not be money in it, but there's certainly academics who wouldn't have to do something for money. There are some public interest journalists still out there. And just the complete lack of awareness about how a campaign like that, with the kind of pressure that they put on me, put on someone else, could lead to death, could lead to a massive reorientation of some sort of political thing. Like, I'm nobody, right? If they had done it to someone who wasn't nobody, it might have been a different thing. Maybe it was so powerful because I am nobody. Maybe the campaign is enough to just make sure that someone with a critical, thoughtful voice is just going to, maybe not agree to step into that position because it's so brutal and so difficult. But the implications it has on public discourse are undeniable, and they're scary. And I just can't believe that no one out there seems interested in studying that. Instead, we just wring our hands and we're like, oh, the Russians are meddling in elections or whatever it is, right? And it's like, guys, we have our own examples of this stuff in Canada. I'm not the only one either. There's a direct line to the propaganda creation of the Toronto Sun, of people connected to the Fords, of people connected to Kenney, of Kenney himself.
Yep.
Like, don't you see that this is the arm of the state, like, literally crushing dissent? Do you not see that? So, take me out of the equation, remove my name from any of this stuff. Just study what happened so we can learn from it, or not, or just be surprised every single time Jason Kenney manages to get away with being the victim again. And then journalists are like, hey, we're just doing our best. We're just covering it. It's just the news, right? And it's like, can you step back like 1 foot? Just take a foot step backwards to look at how all of these forces are actually entwined, and they are playing you, and you are a willing participant, whether or not you are even aware of it. And it's sad, right? It's like, holy crow, like, do something with your career or your platform or your critical eye or your critical thought. Do something.
Well, paying the mortgage, unfortunately, has become a very high priority in corporate journalism. I'm going to kind of play the advocate here. Do you think that the next time, because there will be one, what if it does result in a death, in a suicide? Is that when something will finally be done? It's all fun till somebody loses an eye. Is that the mentality here?
I mean, the proof of that is also in the pudding. Like, there have been high-profile cases of online harassment leading to people killing themselves. We know this, right? That Vertea Parsons is a name that everybody knows because of this, and her family has done a lot to talk about online harassment and bullying. The problem is that government has taken that and has seen that and said, okay, well, this is a question about online harassment and bullying, and we need to stop bullying. And it's like, no, it is not about bullying. It's about people using tools to drive someone to hurt themselves or to kill themselves. That's not bullying. And that's the interesting neoliberal conception of this thing, that it's like that it's one person against another person, and then one person is the bully and one person is being bullied, and we need to stop that bully from being a bully, right? And it takes all of the intention of the system to hurt people who are vulnerable, whether they're women or young women or racialized people or indigenous or disabled or queer. It's like this is the system has been set up to do this. And so we have had the ultimate tragedy out of these situations. It wasn't political in the same way as what happened to me was political, was what happened to other people has been political, but it is absolutely a political act to drive someone to that end, right? And for fundamental change to be taken by government to stop the harassment and torture of young women, I mean, then we're talking about system change. So then it's just as easy to talk about bullying, and let's talk about bullying, and bullying is bad, right? It's so sad. And so, of course, it's going to happen again. Of course, it's not going to change if something even worse happens. It might make some people go, oh, wow, I never saw this before. It might create good things, but can we not wait until that moment, right? Like, let's save lives rather than wait for them to be taken from us before we are moved to action.
I agree 100%. And, of course, a big issue in this was free speech. Now I want to move to something you wrote in the National Observer at the end of last August. First, I'll say that I've met politicians, federal, provincial, for decades. And on the one hand, I will say I have met Emperor Harper, the most arrogant, self-entitled, self-aggrandizing politician I've ever met in my life is Jason Kenney. But otherwise, I did go to the Kenney-Doug Ford-Lugan rally in Calgary to axe the carbon tax. I am confident in saying I have never seen a more inept, useless shell of a politician than Doug Ford. He is the absolute worst I have ever seen. He can barely put two sentences together in front of a live microphone. But yet, Doug Ford is going specifically, in a lot of different ways, against free speech. And one of the biggest he's done is with coercing post-secondary education Ontario by, not directly, but it's pretty obvious, he's threatening them to be more open to right-wing ideology, shutting down left-wing ideology, or somehow there could be funding issues. I've got no other word to describe this as the act of a fascist government to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not only doing it at the institutional level, he's doing it at the public level. They set up the snitch hotline all over the roar about rolling back the sexual curriculum in Ontario schools. I find this really, really invasive. The snitch hotline were for people to snitch on teachers, basically. And there was no parameters, no categories. You didn't have to prove anything or even give your name. How is this nothing but a database of dirt? How can they get away with saying this has anything at all to do with the level of education in Ontario when all it is a dog whistle to those who feel they are outside the mainstream to bitch and complain and then give the Ford government an excuse to take action? You want to talk about bullying? This is bullying by the state.
Oh, yeah.
This is an attack on many levels, and it's an attack on speech. It's an attack on unions. It's an attack on the future generations of Ontario. How does this manage to start up and run? And in this instance, I saw from Alberta a lot of the corporate media actually just reporting the facts this time because they didn't want to get into the moral consequences of it. But yet, on other matters where they should be reporting facts, oops, that makes our boy look like shit. No, let's make up some moral thesis for it. When government starts doing this on a institutional level, shouldn't people be a lot more upset about this than they are?
I think that the real problem is that there's no ways for that expression of anger to be formalized. And so are people angry? Like everyone that I know is angry, right? Everybody that I know, that's people who are activists, that are people who are not activists, it's people who are teachers or who work in daycares. Like everybody I know who is angry. But without a way to crystallize that anger into something, it's very hard to see it because it's just individual expressions of people being angry. Doug Ford is the natural evolution of what Mike Harris brought us in the 90s. And the Liberals set the pieces up for Ford to just walk in and just knock them all down perfectly. The Liberals were plagued by scandal after scandal. They had $1 billion scandal with Orange, the air ambulance program. They had $1 billion scandal with eHealth. They had billions of dollars of scandal with the gas plants in Mississauga. Like, just so much money was wasted by the province. The Green Energy Act, even. Like, the Green Energy Act, if you look at it, like, we were guaranteeing profit to corporations to be subsidized by ratepayers for energy that we didn't need. It's like, thanks for fucking up green energy, guys. The combination of those two forces in opposition with one and another from the mid-90s, Bob Rae set up the stage for the Conservatives to come, for Mike Harris to come in. We're just seeing things just devolve and devolve and devolve and devolve. And no one is bold enough to say, like, we need a radical realignment of the public sector. We need to massively tax people in the higher incomes, and we need to restore tax brackets. And here's what people get from that restoration of tax brackets. We need a radical change in the healthcare system. We need a home care system that actually is a home care system that's not private or for profit. And the same thing, we need a daycare system. Like, there's so many things that we easily could be talking about implementing and to wave the flag against Doug Ford, but it takes people in key positions of opposition to do that. The NDP has not been able to do that. The Liberals are at fault. They're not able to do that. The labor movement has not found an effective way to voice their opposition to things that are outside of perhaps the GM closure in Oshawa. And so then that leaves who? Right? It leaves like me and Sandy on our podcast. At least there's activists in Toronto like Kathy Crow, who talks about homelessness, and John Clark, who's an anti-poverty activist in Toronto. There's folks like Desmond Cole or other folks at Black Lives Matter who are able to call out some injustices. But my God, like, where are the people that have actual power? Why didn't a single university administrator condemn Doug Ford's attack on free speech of the university sector? Like, that is fucking criminal. That not a single university administrator was like, we will stand up to these attack on free speech, and no, we're not going to play this game. We have our own policies, and that's it. There have been some institutions that have gone that way thanks to student pressure, but our collective ability to oppose power in this country is pathetic. It's a fucking joke. And because it's pathetic and because it's a joke, on the left, the right just walks in and does what they do so well and creates the conditions for the Fords and the Kennys and the Shears or whatever of the world to just destroy. And it's a really desperate situation. And the problem is I don't have a prescription for the fix. Like, I have some ideas of what needs to happen, but short of like shaking a couple of people and being like, can you do this better? Like, I'm a bit of a loss as to say, how exactly we would be able to intervene, because, ideally it's like Andrew Horvath, the leader of the NDP, would be one of the strongest voices against what Ford's doing, and she can't put out a coherent and strong statement. It's like, what are you guys waiting for, actually? What are you waiting for? What attack is it going to take for coherence to be restored?
Well, I find it amazing that the shift in public opinion on Ford in just 6 months is Trumpian in scope, but yet that's the reaction from the public by living with his decisions, more or less. They're not being invoked by the opposition or anybody else, or the media for that matter, for the most, besides maybe the Star. But the thing that scares the hell out of me is, like I said, all I had to do is watch this guy for like 30 seconds in this room of 2,000 belt buckles and cowboy hats. And it's just like, this guy's a fucking idiot. And yet they all stand there and encourage it and eat it up.
Right. It's because it's not about Ford, right? It's about what he's doing. It isn't about him at all, personally.
So what you're saying is you can have an absolute puppet that can sell something that's a big enough lie, and it triggers enough people that they think, yeah, that's what I think too. They're all on the same goddamn level, except that guy up there in the suit and the bleached hair has the power to get it done. So I'm with him. Is that what we've come to?
To an extent, but like, again, who would you throw your support behind at this point if you were looking for a strong opposing voice? You can either find yourself siding with power, and none of his reforms have hit people yet. So let's also keep that in mind, that they're still in a honeymoon because the reforms themselves are going to take a little bit of time before they actually hurt people. But you can't park your political support anywhere else. Right? So are they supporting Ford, or is he the default because no one's coming around with an alternative saying, look at all the things that we actually need, and this is what we need to fight, and this is how we're going to fight it, and here's the various proposals to change his ideas. His attack on the Greenbelt will be interesting to watch, because that's an issue that crosses political lines. The city council or town council in Orangeville, Ontario, has actually just voted unanimously against one of their bills, and it's helping to change the channel. So we haven't actually seen any effective opposition to Ford and how Ford manages that. And I think that that's partly why you see such support for him, because people need to actually see opposition to feel like they can be opposed to something. Because otherwise, you're just kind of like opposing nothing. You have to park your opposition in someone's hands, in a movement's hands, in an idea's hands, and there's nowhere to do that.
Well, I'm starting to see rumors, reports that Ford is backing off on the green belt and the changes to water inspection and monitoring. Those issues do cross all lines. Do you think that maybe he hasn't been beaten back on anything yet? He will only get more brazen until that first time happens?
Oh, yeah. Oh, and the thing about Ford is it's like he will become more and more brazen, and the only things that people will be able to stop are the ones that they beat back themselves. And I think everything is beatable, but it will require that every victory is fought for. Nothing will be handed to anybody. And that is difficult because that requires movements to be sophisticated and well-funded and well-oriented with good strategy, right? So that's the dilemma right now, is that there aren't any of those movements out there. And so it looks like he's unbeatable. But the guy's a coward. You know, Sandy and I say this on our show all the time. If you occupied an office of one of these cowards, like, they would lose their mind. They would freak out. You do that for a couple of days, and yeah, they're going to back down on some of their policy. There's no question about that.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. I mean, look at the big stink in the States about people like McConnell. Somebody tells them to fuck off in a restaurant, and oh my God, we can't have this.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, I agree. I can remember back, I believe in 2012 or 13, I was part of a protest outside Kenny's constituency office in Calgary. Mm-hmm. Not only did the whole place have mirrored windows anyway, real open group, but they sent out some guy who looked like he was about 90 years old, and all he had to say was, "Everybody fuck off, we called the cops."
Right.
You know, I agree. These people are complete cowards. They don't think they're accountable, and until they find out otherwise, I guess we know what's going to happen. I don't understand why there hasn't been more already in Ontario. He ordered back the York University workers on strike. He's cost Ontario $103 million by refusing to follow through with the Avista deal in Washington State. He keeps talking this for the people. What, the 15 people in his backyard barbecue? Are those the people? I mean, this is just such a blatant lie. The entire quote-unquote platform. Yes, there is the Toronto Sun and the National Post and the Globe and Mail, the Strobe and Fail, that will stick to power, stick to money. But do you think, as you said, all these things have not gotten down to ground level yet? Do you think when they do, we'll see a real change in what's going on in Ontario for opposition?
No, I think that the only thing that's going to change opposition and how opposition expresses itself is that if we start to finally understand that social change happens through movement structures, and that we start to restore movement structures to the political scene. And whether or not that takes the labor and its resources and its leadership and its experiences to actually hire organizers to help start building something, or if that takes activists who've been at it for many, many years coming together and forming something new, the only way that you can confront Doug Ford in any fundamental way that isn't just maybe one-offs like these Greenbelt votes is going to be through mounting a proper movement. And movements often form in the face of incredible attack. So, you know, I've got a bit of optimism that it's possible, but it will absolutely require the left to radically rearrange and transform how it operates in Ontario. And so that means that people who do occupy the left in Ontario, from the NDP to the labor movement to what is left of some social movement organizing, have to really reflect critically on their own limitations and what needs to change about how they organize themselves for them to be successful and to be effective again.
So I see a real tactical brilliance in trying to put post-secondary education institutions into a box, trying to limit the freedom of thought in the public system before they even get there. And isn't that something that we see all over the world in more what is called authoritarian governments, that compliance has a price tag on it? And we're not really used to that in Canada. But it seems to me like that's exactly what Ford's going to try and pull off. And as long as the penalty for not playing ball is deemed to be so overwhelming, institutions are not going to have much of anything to do with any real resistance against this kind of government. So really, we have no other alternative than people.
Yes, except that these institutions can all be forced into action, right? So it's always people power. But if you think of it of a university, for example, like the government made this attack on free speech, but they've also just announced huge changes to the public assistance programs, so the grants and loans program of Ontario. And then they've just basically promised to end student autonomous organizing. And so these are massive changes that will fundamentally alter and hurt progressive organizing in this country. Because, of course, the reach will be far beyond Ontario. And, I know that there's been a statement made from all the student unions in Alberta in solidarity with what's going on in Ontario students, probably because they see that Jason Kenney will do it in Alberta next. To get, university administrators, there's going to be some that love this, and there's going to be some that are uneasy with it. And the students and faculty and staff job will be to find the administrators who are uncomfortable with it and force them through whatever means they have to take a stand and to actually start drawing lines in the sand. So all of our institutions can be taken over to some measure. And of course it is people power and people organizing that's going to make that happen. But we need to start thinking outside of the box. We need to do things differently. We need to ramp up our pressure tactics. Our pressure tactics have to bring people along. We have to organize people. You have to talk to people. You have to get them on your side. And then you have to move from anything from an educational or wiring or sitting down or having a conversation with people, moving those people towards action. And those actions have to be clever and they have to be effective. And that only comes from brainstorming. That only comes from having meetings and talking to people and seeing what people's comfort levels are and seeing what people's creativity levels are and their skills to figure out what your capacity, collective capacity might be in any given moment.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Some of that, what you just said, I've seen that evidence in the growth of Lead Now across Canada. I think when they have their get-togethers in cities or areas, that is their focus. That is absolutely their focus. What is it exactly that you have a problem with? And what else in these other set of problems do you think deserve attention? And they're looking for common ground. That's a number one thing when you walk in the door, common ground. And I think that encourages engagement and it encourages returning. So many protests and movements, especially in cities, have a kickoff meeting. And it's standing room only. And then a month later, there's the 10 people who put it together, and that's it.
Right.
Is that something that there's a way around, or do you have to accept that as part of the environment when you're trying to create something?
Of course, it's something that you can get around. You have to figure out what people are turned on by. Are they turned on by endless meetings, or is that only going to bring out a certain kind of person? Are you able to break those meetings up to be different nights or to make sure that the excitement is building and not diminishing, right? Diminishing attendance to your meetings is usually an indication that something's up and something's not going right. And so you have to change your tactics. But when things are going right, you have a movement. You actually have more and more people come out. And there's tons of examples of when this happens. And, I was just involved in an election campaign for a local candidate who was so exciting. She's basically a national or a province-wide celebrity now, where our events started with good successes. Our platform launch had 30 people at it. We're like, okay, fine, this is all right. The launch itself was anticipated by a lot of people, and so there was 500 people showed up to that. And then all of a sudden, the momentum around this election culminated in a victory of more than 8,000 votes in a riding that the party has never, ever won and came in fourth place in 2014. So there are examples of this. But again, if everything that you're doing is resulting in fewer people coming out, then there's a problem with some way that you're approaching organizing. And you need to ask the people who've stopped coming, why they've stopped coming, and then maybe you'll find the answer to how to become more effective.
Very good point. Very good point. And again, like you said, you have to have your groundwork done. You have to have a real clear idea of what it is you're mobilizing against. You don't want to be Occupy 2019. Well, I'm glad that you still see as much hope as you do, because, that's just kind of my job here to play the contrarian. I really do see Ford as a huge, significant factor on the Canadian scene, not just because of what he represents and what he's pushing, but just because of the sheer incompetence of the man to get to this level of authority in our country. I mean, this is the type of guy I expect to see I mean, I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but this is the kind of guy I expect to see running a Central African republic that has diamonds and oil as their only exports, and everybody's crooked as the day is long. That's the kind of place I would expect a guy like Doug Ford to be in control. But yet in Ontario, he did it.
I mean, yeah, except that, keep in mind that Ontario is also the mining capital of the world. And so we export a lot of the bad practices of leadership that you might see, and neo-colonial policies and governments still exist within our own borders as well, right? I mean, as I say, I think it's important to see Ford not as an anomaly, but as the obvious next step after Mike Harris.
No, I think that's valid. I guess I'm just shocked that this next step could be that fucking stupid.
I know. So if you're interested in finding out more about what I write or want to listen to the podcast, you can check me out. I write for the National Observer, so you can check me out in that publication. I'm also among the virtual pages of the Washington Post's Global Opinions section. So I'm one of the few Canadian writers there. Definitely one of the few Canadian writers on the left over there. And if you want to hear the podcast, you can head to www.sandyandnora.com. And we broadcast as much as we can, basically once a week. We're back to a normal schedule, although we started off 2009 with a double episode. So there's 2 new episodes there for 2009 already for you to listen to.
There you go, everybody. I will say from just my personal experience, there are a fair amount of women here in Edmonton. I mentioned, have you heard about Sandy and Nora? Oh, yeah.
No way.
Yeah, so you are making an impact with your immediate demographic. I hope it spreads. I hope it continues to grow because both your voice and Sandy's need space in Canada. There needs to be a hell of a lot more of us who have this perspective. I hope that continues. I hope it's not calamitous events that causes a resurgence in what I call humanist viewpoints. I hope not. But we'll see what happens. But for those of us already here, we ain't stopping anytime soon, correct?
Correct.
Thank you very much for the interview, Nora Loretto.
Thanks for having me on.
So there you go, Nora Loretto. I will say that interview was a lot of fun to do. Tonight was Season 10, Episode 17. There won't be another The View Up Here for the entire month of February. This is something that I don't half-ass. If I don't have the time to put in what I consider to be a worthy effort on a topic or with a guest, then I'm not going to do it because, pride, I guess. Also loyalty to my listeners. I don't like to turn out bullshit. But there will not be The View Up Here in February of 2019. I have to devote my time to another issue. It's time for a new residence. That is a priority. Until that happens, who knows? If things go well and I can be back sooner, then I'll be back sooner. But that's it. There will be a month off. But hey, you can listen to a podcast that gets just a few more listens than this one. SandyandNora.com. Let's hope the Alberta election writ doesn't drop too soon. Still a lot of work to do on that and guests to have on. Otherwise, that's it for tonight. No more with NoLore. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. Good night.